created. I had this tank, and we had 2 layers, a little ping pong ball, and this was blue food coloring. So what do you learn about stratification in terms of how it affects the distribution of the zone materials and the particles? Okay, so the stratification itself is a barrier, right? So stratification itself is a barrier to the dissolved materials. So the food coloring represents the dissolved material, right? So the dissolved material, so you have just a beaker with water, and then you added the food coloring. Even you add a little drop, just by diffusion, this whole thing would become right away, it would get blue. But it didn't here. I mean, we let it sit overnight. It probably will. You probably start getting. You can actually see a little mixing also occurring at the interface. But the sharp density discontinuity help maintain it. Right? So that's really important because as we talk about climate, you'll see there's a big important interaction between the deep sea and the surface of the sea. The surface ocean and deep ocean. The surface ocean is in exchange with the atmosphere. So let's imagine this is the ocean. So the top layer is in contact with the atmosphere, so it's exchange of gases. If you get stuff down here in the deep sea, it's separated from circulation from the atmosphere for the time it takes for this to be remixed. Okay, so that's an important part. In terms of particles, we put this ping pong ball here. The ping pong ball is set at an interface. So interfaces are really important because materials tend to sink. Even living phytoplankton, for example, tend to sink. So they tend to have there tends to be an accumulation of material here, both living and non-living. So things that feed on it, like fish and zooplankton, can also aggregate here. And it's an important area of high biological activity and chemical activity. So if you're a scientist, an ecologist looking at the marine system, it's important to determine if the system is stratified and where the layers are, because it gives you information about where to sample and where important activities are going on. Okay, so that's number 1. Okay, so how about number 2? Number 2 was kind of interesting. You put it in motion. So we have the waves. I'll put surface waves, and then middle waves. And we compared the length, the height, and the speed. Right? So which ones were longer, the surface or the middle wave? So who says that the surface waves were longer? 1, 2 people? Okay, so just a draw. So we're looking at waves here, right? So once you start creating them, so how do the bottom ones compare to the surface ones? So you're saying that the bottom ones were longer? Okay, so kind of like that? Something like that? Okay. Sometimes. Okay. Any other observations? I'll tell you kind of what I was hoping to see, and as a limitation of the experiment. Right? So when you first put it in motion, usually you get the surface waves tend to be taller, and they break. Sometimes they break out and spill over, right? And they seem to move faster, right? And have the shorter wavelength. Okay. But once you let it settle, maybe by the next time I do this, I said, once you let it settle, once you move it, and wait maybe a couple seconds, and once the system kind of slows down, how does each layer moving separately? And this is kind of what I expected to see. So I'll kind of tell you. I'll put it. Whenever I do this, people see different things, but I think this explains why. Okay? So what I'm expecting to see after it settles a little bit is that the surface wave should be longer wavelength, and the ones in the bottom should be kind of like this. Anybody saw this? Some people saw this, okay. A few people. Some people didn't see that. But I think the reason is at the beginning, what you see is this thing kind of spilling over, and you have this thing. And once it settles, it kind of does this, okay? Alright, so why do we see this? The reason is that the surface, the definition of a wave is energy propagating over two fluids. So this is moving between air and water. So when you create this big wave, it's because it's pushing towards air, which is very light, and then gravity is starting to restore the wave. So the top wave gets restored really quickly because it's, you get this wave shape, but the gravity is pushing on it, and there's nothing really to hold it. Whereas the bottom is moving between fresh water and salt water. And this is a little bit denser. So once you create a wave, there's more density to support the wave height. So you should see something like this. Okay. In terms of the speed, I think the people see which one was faster, the surface or the bottom? Was faster? Was moving faster?
Or we would move, the top one would stop before the bottom. So the top one would be east and the bottom would start moving.
Okay, great. So similar to this, right? The surface got flattened really quickly, and then you still saw motions in the bottom, right? Okay. And that's analogous to, let's say you have two carts, one has weight and the other one has very little weight. You push them with the same energy, right? So the one that doesn't have weight, it moves, and then the energy gets dissipated quicker, right? So it's a little bit of part of how the momentum is preserved because they have different densities. Let's see what else we put there. Okay, so the mixing, I kind of maybe combine a little lecturing here. So I show you this because it's important to recognize that there's two layers. There's a freshwater and a lighter layer and a bottom layer. So it's the same as the deep sea and the surface of the ocean, right? Surface of the ocean and deep sea. Okay. So in terms of the composition, generally speaking, you expect the bottom waters to have more nutrients. Nutrients are things that feed phytoplankton. Sometimes can call fertilizers, but nutrients kind of more technical term. And there's usually more nutrients down here. Why? Well, as organisms fall, they decompose here, and there's no light for photosynthesis. So there's an accumulation of things that support photosynthesis below the pycnoplast. But phytoplankton need light, right? So light's on the surface, and they need nutrients that tend to be below. So there's generally little productivity unless you combine them. And the only way to combine them is somehow bring this deep water to the surface. And that's by mixing. Right? So we'll see anytime you get some mixing can be beneficial because it brings the nutrients to where there's light and organisms have the best of both worlds. The downside, and you see things like in Antarctica where there's huge mixing, the mixing is so severe that actually can be detrimental. Why would it be detrimental? If you have phytoplankton here and there's a big storm that happened in the Southern Ocean, if you're pushed to depths that are really great and there's no light for photosynthesis, then you don't get enough light to be able to use those nutrients. Right? So too much mixing is not good. Mixing generally tends to be good. So, anyways, the last one, I'll explain the formation of the Mediterranean. That's kind of interesting, and it leads you to understanding deep ocean circulation. So there was a stage in the experiment where you separated the tank, right, and you mixed this water, right, and you had the salt water, fresh water, and this, they call it intermediate water. And when you remove this, what you should have seen is this intermediate water move in like that, right? So all this water had intermediate salinity between the fresh and the salt. So it didn't sink to the bottom because it has some fresh water in it. It didn't go to the surface because it has salt water in it. So it reached its own level here in the middle. But what I wanted to illustrate is that it created motion, secondary circulation. The water moved in this direction to replace the outflow, and there's a quick movement outside of the when you remove the container, right? So as an example, we call thermohaline circulation. Thermohaline circulation is what drives the deep ocean currents. And it's because thermo means temperature. Thermal halon circulation is what drives the deep ocean currents. And it's because thermo means temperature. Halon means salt. These two things affect the density. So when you get a water mass that sinks, it creates horizontal motion because it pushes the water as it sinks and creates movement. This is related to the Mediterranean. I kind of mentioned that because the Mediterranean, something really interesting occurs. You got the Mediterranean basin, and the Mediterranean is really tends to be warm. There's not much fresh water coming in, so it's almost like an inland sea, and it flows into the Atlantic. Flows into the Atlantic, and it's very interesting what happens because the Mediterranean, compared to the Atlantic, the temperature is higher than the Atlantic, which makes the density lower than the Atlantic, but the salinity is also higher than the Atlantic. So it's a little bit denser than the Atlantic. So putting it together, what happens when the Mediterranean water flows out of the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, it kind of does what you did in your experiment. So the Mediterranean water comes out, has this unique density, and it sinks, but it stays kind of in the middle. So the Mediterranean water retains its identity as it slowly mixes with the Atlantic. And you can be out here in a boat, sailboat, sampling that we're going to do next week. This Thursday. And as you go down with depth, you'll see the temperature decreasing as you expect. And then all of a sudden it will increase. I say, there's something weird there. It makes sense. And then the temperature will decrease again. I said, how could you have temperature? How could you have warmer temperature below lower temperature? It doesn't make sense. And it'll make sense when you look at salinity, because salinity will go up as you expect, and then there'll be a peak of salinity, and they'll go down again. So this unique combination will tell you that's the Mediterranean water. Right? When I learned this when I was in graduate school, somebody told me that during World War II, the German submarines would use this to get in and out of the Mediterranean, because the Strait of Gibraltar is really narrow, and Gibraltar is part of England, so they have a naval base there. So the submarines would basically go out, turn the engines off, and depending whether they're going to go in and out, they would position themselves at that particular depth. Right? So if they want to go out, they go close to the surface, so the net flow would be, they go deeper down, and net flow is out to the Atlantic, and the net flow into the Mediterranean would be at a lower depth. Great. Okay. So let's go back to our lecture here. So we're gonna discuss that. Let me show you a little bit of ocean circulation. I'll show the circulation on the surface and the bottom, then we'll talk about the field first. Okay. So the surface of the ocean, this surface part of the ocean, the circulation, is really wind driven. So next week we'll talk about the interactions of the ocean and the atmosphere, and you'll see how the surface currents are regulated by the wind currents. And then that also affects climate. Okay. So you can see here, the currents are in these big, thick lines. The red are the warm currents, and the blue are the colder currents. And the little arrows indicate the motion of the winds. So you can see some correspondence between the wind motion and the motion of the waters below it. Okay. So you get this circulation cells called gyres. So for a purpose of understand climate regulation, you can see that temperature is warmest at the equator, so warms those water masses. As the water masses flow to higher latitudes, they release that heat, warming up those higher latitudes. A major example of climate regulation due to these currents is the Gulf Stream. So you can see here the water gets really warm in the Atlantic, and it goes up in the Gulf Stream, and that actually serves to keep the United Kingdom fairly warm relative to the land that's further to the east in Europe. So the Gulf Stream is a major. I think you can see it here. It's color coded. Here's the Gulf Stream. All this red is the warm water that's being transported to higher latitudes. And for the sake of time, I won't show you the animations, but you can just, when you get to see my slides, you can just click on them. They're pretty cool. One shows you the ocean circulation, and the other one shows you how temperature varies at different latitudes. Okay. So that's the surface circulation. The deep ocean circulation is the thermohaline circulation because it's not driven by the winds separated from the atmosphere. So the circulation of it is driven by different factors. This top section shows a cross section around the Atlantic. So here's the Southern Ocean, Antarctica. Here's the Arctic Ocean here on the right. And what happens around Greenland and in the Southern Ocean, close to Antarctica, water gets really cold and also gets very dry. There's a lot of evaporation more than precipitation, so the water gets really salty, denser, it's very cold, denser, and it sinks. So you have sinking of water both in the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic. Most in the North Atlantic, the major formation of deep sea water is in the North Atlantic. So as it sinks, it generates this circulation. Was there a question? And oftentimes this is referred to as the conveyor belt. It's not quite a conveyor belt, but as a simplification, it works to visualize it. So here's a top view. So the formation of that deep water mass is mostly here in the North Atlantic and also in parts of the South Atlantic, and that drives the circulation. So this deep ocean circulation takes on the order of about 1,000 years. That's kind of general residence time, how long it takes for the circulation to be completed. And I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but some of the ideas that the humans have thought of kind of geoengineering solutions to global climate change to save us some time is to find some ways by which carbon dioxide that's in excess in the atmosphere can be inserted into the deep sea circulation. So we can get it below the thermocline. It ends up in here, and then it's caught in here for about 1,000 years or more if some of the carbon becomes ocean sediments. Then it's sequestered for millions of years. How do we get water being connected? Right? So we have the surface of the ocean and the deep ocean. So how do we connect them? Well, there's some parts of the world that are called upwelling regions. And upwelling regions are places where water upwells. So the water comes from the deep sea and it goes into the surface. So why would that happen? Okay. You have the surface of the ocean, the deep sea, so this is rich in nutrients, and also carbon dioxide. There's a lot of CO2 down here. Okay. So how do we break the stratification? Right? So one way is to upwell. So when does upwelling occur? Well, upwelling occurs primarily when wind blows along a continent. So let's show upwelling here, and this would be the southern hemisphere. No, is it? Right. No, sorry, this is the northern hemisphere, right? You should know because of the way the deflection of the water occurs. So in the northern hemisphere, if you have wind blowing from the north to the south, the deflection is to the west, to the right of the motion. Right? So in this case, and that happens here in the Washington coast, Oregon coast, California coast, when you have a situation with wind blowing from the north to the south, the water gets pushed to the right of the motion because of the Coriolis effect. And then that forces water from the bottom to come to the surface to replace the one that's moved offshore. That's called upwelling. If the wind then shifts and blows to the north, the transfer then is towards the shore. And you kind of pile up water on the shore, which leads to downwelling. Right? So a lot of the mixing occurs due to this process. There's only a few places in the world where there's this upwelling, and there happen to be some of the most productive parts in the world. So due to this process, there's only a few places in the world where there's this upwelling, and there happen to be some of the most productive parts in the world. So it's a color-coded map of where most of the productivity occurs in the oceans. And the highest productivity is purple. The next productivity is in green. So what is the pattern? The highest productivity is in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places of the ocean. And those are areas where there's upwelling. There's constant upwelling. There's deep water coming to the surface with nutrients. Nutrients and light leads to high productivity. And the areas that are the poorest are in the middle of the oceans, basins. The next productivity range is all the coastal systems. Right? So if you put together coastal systems, they're where the most of biological productivity occurs. the upwelling zones and the coastal regions. Okay. So how does this connect to global climate change? On the one hand, is to recognize that the oceans is not uniformly productive. So for humans, they're interested in fishery, et cetera, et cetera. These coastal systems are really important as a resource, and they're particularly vulnerable to global climate change because of sea level rise. Shallow waters tend to warm up faster than deep waters, so that can affect their biota. But one of the important things that I'm going to show you as part of this class is that the coastal system is a huge area where carbon cycling occurs. A lot of carbon is taken up through productivity because of this high productivity. A lot of it comes into the biota, and a lot of it is buried because the continents have sediment that are being constantly eroded, and some of that organic material is sequestered, is buried. The long-term geologic timescale carbon cycling depends on how much of that carbon is sequestered along the coastal region. And fast forward to the present, it's important to recognize the importance of the coastal zone in terms of carbon sequestration, how much carbon is removed naturally, and to not lose that process. Right? As we put it more into the atmosphere, we also need to make sure the natural ways in which carbon is removed are still preserved. Right? So there are multiple reasons why we need to understand the coastal system. All right, great. And that leads to the estuary, and leads to, I have like 10 minutes to talk about the field trip, okay? So an estuary is a part of a coastal system, and is where fresh water meets salt water. So we have that here, right? This is where, hopefully all of you are familiar, there's Olympia, looking north. Here's a capital lake, a capital, and the estuaries where salt and fresh water meet. Fresh water from the Deschutes River, ocean water comes in from Puget Sound. So this is the estuary, this mixing area. And we're gonna do our study just north of here's the 4th Avenue Bridge. And on the other side, you can see here's the Port of Olympia, here's downtown Olympia, and there's a farmer's market. We're gonna meet there and do a little oceanographic study there. All right, so okay, maybe the logistics first. Okay, so check for this, and then at the end of the day, if you don't know still how to get there, let me know, and tomorrow, or today, I can give you maps and stuff. Right? So this is a map of Olympia, farmer's market, a Thriftway store. I guess this is a further view of it. So if you go here, the farmer's market is up here. This is State and 4th, and State there's a bus depot. So if you take the bus, which is free in Olympia, it's just a few blocks away. Here is Anthony's restaurant. So I can give you the address. People Google it. There's Anthony's restaurant there, and then the Port Plaza, observation tower, is a dock. So we're gonna meet at the dock at 9. So people ask about parking. You have to pay for parking downtown Olympia as you drive. The farmer's market is not open, so depending on parking, the parking lot there says 2 hours limit. So I guess at your risk if they check. I don't think they check in the winter, right? So that's where I'll park. And if it's busy in the winter, in the summer, that they put us, somebody walks around with a little chalk and make sure you're not there for longer than 2 hours. But anyway, so there's plenty of parking there. Okay, so we're gonna meet here at 9 on Thursday. And what are we gonna do? Oh, here's a even better picture. Okay, this is all are gonna be nice slides, right? So I'll post this one. So here's the viewing tower, here's a dock, here's a farmer's market. Now we're looking north is to the left here. And what you're gonna do with the size of the class, there's gonna be 4 groups of 3. So once you form your group, each team is gonna do some measurements on the dock using the instruments that you saw in the lab. And the 4 docks that you're gonna be analyzing is one's at Port Plaza, then a group is just gonna walk to the Percival Landing here. And if people drove, hopefully at least a couple of you would drive and you don't mind taking other people with you. I'll send you to 2 locations here. There's a dock here by the Hearthfire Grill. There's another restaurant here with a dock. And then there's this East Bay, the Swantown Marina. There's another dock there. So we're gonna sample the water as it flows out, and that kind of flows out to the ocean by looking at this for locations. Okay. Once you complete your measurements on land, you're gonna go back to the dock here and wait your turn to get into the Evergreen has a boat, outboard boat. It's called the Mother Goose, and the Mother Goose is gonna sample 4 locations now with the axes of mixing from the river up to not very far. We'll maybe go to the tip of the peninsula. It's gonna be, you know, it's never been rough. It's, you know, if you just walk down Olivia, it's gonna be pretty calm. You'll be wearing vests, and we have a Jenna is gonna be the skipper. So it won't take much time. So once you do your land station, one group's gonna go here, do this one, go back. Second group will replace the first group. They'll do another station. So you get the idea. So each team, each person will do had a chance to be in the boat one time, get a chance to do a measurement on land. So you have two measurements, and then you give them to me, and then I'll post them and I'll take you through the analysis. I already posted the handout for the future. Okay. So that's essentially what we'll do. Once you're done with the 2 locations, then you can leave. We did this with 2 groups last time. There was an AM and PM group. With the success of the class, we'll be able to complete everything in the morning, so 9 to noon. Then you'll be done for the day. Okay. Okay. So a little bit about estuaries and last minute, so give you more idea of why they're important. Okay. So I give a lot of lectures to the public about estuaries. And this is an estuarium here is a organization that does outreach. So I put a whole bunch of things here why we care about estuaries. So I highlighted the ones that are relevant to class. But that's all relevant to class, right? So the first one is basically in terms of the natural services that estuaries provide are super important. They're super productive, so again, very vulnerable to sea level rise and for humans to understand how they work and to protect them. And here's some hints of why. You know, habitat and nursery ground for many species. Once you just come and live here, or they just use it and then leave. Also, as a buffer zone between the land and the sea, so things that happen in the estuary kind of protects the land from erosion from the sea, storms and stuff like that. Areas of high carbon sequestration. So when we talk about the carbon cycle, we'll examine that in a lot of detail. How living things are affected by global climate change, but in some sense, an important sense, is they also are part of how climate is regulated through the carbon cycle. The last ones are more about humans and the environment, right? So, and that maybe connects it because it's environmental studies. We're connecting to this human interaction. So we saw some of the implications of an understanding system in the Retreat or Relocate article. So humans love to live by the water, right? So there's a disproportionate amount of concentration lives close to the water. There's resources, there's amenities, people like that. You know, seafood, recreation, and it leads to this tension, right? So people like to live there, but they create a lot of impact. So estuaries, coastal zones are very important for a bunch of different reasons, and they're heavily impacted by human activity. So it's interesting to study them, but for a bunch of purposes. Definition of what is an estuary? Pretty simple. This is a simple definition. Donald Pritchard gave this classic definition. Semi-enclosed body of water, so arm of the sea, embayment, semi-enclosed, protected, within which seawater is measurably diluted with fresh water. I underscore those 2 definitions, and I'll give you the quick rundown of why this definition explains why this area is so productive. To understand it, let's go to what makes an area productive, and by productive I mean explains why this area is so productive. To understand it, let's go to what makes an area productive, and by productive I mean the base of the food chain is productive. The phytoplankton, photosynthetic organisms are productive. So why are they productive? Well, for a photosynthetic organism to be productive, it needs light, water, fertilizer, right? You have a plant, right? How about in an estuary? Well, they don't need water because they're in water, right? But they need light, and then they need nutrients, right? Okay. So if it's semi-enclosed, what happens, the advantage of being semi-enclosed is that the river, because it erodes land, it brings a lot of nutrients with it. It also brings sediment, meaning things that are mineral that are not nutritious. So the phytoplankton will have a problem there because there's a lot of things they want to eat that come from the river, but they can't eat them because they don't have enough light. Right? So what happens when this water hits the estuary? Hits the estuary broadens, is protected, so there's very little mixing. And when there's little mixing, things are suspended, settle. So the particles that come from the river that are blocking the light settle, and the nutrients are dissolved, are available to be utilized. Right? So that's one reason. Okay. So, and diluted freshwater. So freshwater indicates that there's a source of nutrients. Source of nutrients and a way to get rid of the sediments. Right? So you keep that in mind. It'll get you a long ways. Okay. So we'll do a lot of phytoplankton. These are the things that are fueling the basically the food chain. Sometimes they're toxic, sometimes reptiles. This is a mixing of fresh. This is it shows you the mixing of fresh and salt water. And in the experiment that you did in the lab, you added that potassium permanganate, and I was hoping you would see this two-layer flow. The water mass move in different directions. Well, that happens in an estuary. The fresh water has a net flow out to sea, and the seawater has a net flow upstream. And organisms take advantage of that. Some of the organisms that can't fight the currents, if they spend more time in the surface, they end up, going to sea. If they spend more of the time in deep water, they eventually get pushed up the estuary. So things like crabs take advantage of that. This is an image of what you would, I don't know, you'll see it. Sometimes you see this. This cloudy water is the river water coming in, and then sometimes a sharp interface as it hits the salt water, and things start to settle. It settles because of this issue of less energy, right? So you imagine a container full of sediment of different sizes. You add water to it, you shake it, and you let it sit. You can imagine things as the energy of mixing slows down, things start to settle, right? Slow down. So that kind of is happening there. And there's an additional thing that happens that allows the sediment to settle. Okay, look, you're going to be doing this. You're going to either be here or here. Oh, no, you're going to do both. Sorry, you're going to do both. This is the boat. So instead of Alberto, it's going to be Jenna, and you can take up to 4 students. You're not going to go very far, so each person will be maybe 15 minutes or 20 at the most. And then you'll be in the dock. Hopefully, it won't be like pouring like it was this time, but be prepared for it. So dress like that, okay? And this is that mixing. Yeah, it's kind of cool mixing. Okay, so the flocculation, I'm going to tell you about this. Okay, so it's funny because there's 2 major processes that lead to the settling of sediments from the river. And it's very important, right? Because with the sediments in the water column, there's no life for organisms to use the nutrients. Okay. So one way the minerals are deposited is by the lowering of energy. The other one is called flocculation. Flocculation is more of a chemical, physical process, and that's when particles come into seawater. Seawater has different ions, which have different charges. So particles that come in from the river acquire charges as they enter seawater. And opposites attract. So essentially, all those little particles that are coming from the fresh water flocculate. They form flocks, which are aggregates. They form aggregates, and then these aggregates have the density to allow them to settle. So there's 2 things that happen, right? So it's lower energy and the presence of seawater that creates this flocculation. 2 things: remove sediments, and then the nutrients. And I want to have the nutrients are dissolved, so the nutrients are never going to settle. The nutrients are dissolved by coming in, and then they can lead to high productivity. Okay. We'll learn later on that in addition to the phytoplankton, there's a bunch of other things that contribute to productivity, like seagrasses, marsh plants, and that's why we're going to go to this wildlife to look at this later on in the course. I'll show you that later. This is just an example. This is quantitative information showing you that estuaries are some of the most productive. This is a list of different habitats and their productivity, and estuaries kind of almost the top. The most productive is coral reefs and kelp beds, estuaries, and estuaries. Their range is almost as high as cropland, intensely managed cropland. Okay, I'll just finish this. This is what you're going to measure, read the handout, and then we're going to go over it. But part of the write out is write out the reports to explain why you're kind of tell you right now. So we're going to measure temperature and salinity with a probe. We're going to go in depth. So why? Well, what kind of information does that give us? Stratification, right? So we want to map the stratification. So we measure temperature and salinity, and you're going to plot it and see if there's a gradient, right? We need to know the light penetration. Is it really getting more light as we move away from the river? Right? Is there a zone where the plant have the best of both worlds? You know, the sediment has disappeared. There's more light. There's nutrients, so that may be zones where there's more activity. We're going to measure oxygen, right? Because oxygen is an indicator of photosynthetic activity, so we can use it as an indicator. We'll take a plankton tow. We'll collect plankton. We probably won't have time to see it because we're going to do the beach field trip next week, and then we'll do a microscopy to look at the phloem. And then the tide, actually we're pretty lucky. You guys heard about the king tides? You know what a king tide is? What is it? What's a king tide?
Because of the orbit of the moon and like the timing, tides combine at the highest point of the season.
Great. Briefly, king tides imply that the tides with the highest amplitude of the year. So the king tides. Okay, so when they occur, I should give a lecture on tides, but I'll maybe mention a few things. But just very quickly, has to do with the alignment of the sun and the moon. But we do have an alignment of the sun and the moon every new moon and full moon. So that's when you have the highest tides of the lunar day, or the lunar month. But king tides is a combination of being the sun and the moon being in line, and other things that contribute to the tides, such as the distance of the Earth to the sun and the Earth to the moon, and the angle at which all those celestial bodies align. So the hugest tides that you can get is when the sun and the moon are aligned, like you have a new moon and full moon, when the sun and the moon are closest to the Earth, and the angles are such that they all line with each other. But I think that doesn't occur occurs every 10,000 years or so. But seasonally during the year, there are the highest tides, they're called the king tides, that usually occur in the fall, winter, like now. And I don't know if anybody saw yesterday, we're like, whoa, they're really high. And then when we're out there during the day, they're all going to be really high. So maybe we'll be at their king tide. Okay, great. So that's it for today. I just went over a little bit. So have a good lunch. Come back here at 1, and we'll get started with another popular media presentation. And we'll go over the quiz. Okay, have a good lunch.